pandemic and its impact on distance learning and working from home has helped illuminate the digital divide, which is the gap between those who have access to high-speed internet and devices and those who do not. People working remotely, getting treatment through telehealth, and students attending school online, or even trying to make appointments to obtain the COVID-19 vaccine, really amplifies the need for consistent quality broadband in all areas of the country. More importantly, those without access to broadband and devices run the risk of being left further behind. Given that we are gathering online today instead of meeting in person, we wondered how many of you in the audience had to upgrade your broadband service to keep working. Let us know in the chat box. For myself, I completely lucked out. On Friday, March 13th, 2020 was the last day that NCSL staff actually worked in our NCSL offices. And I ended up taking that Thursday right before off to have my service provider upgrade my service just so I could get the good bundle price, not realizing how important it would turn out to be. I am Heather Morton, and I am a program principal in the Fiscal Affairs program with the National Conference of State Legislatures. With me is my colleague, Abby Gruelle, who is a senior committee director in our DC office. Together, we cover the state and federal sides of broadband and telecommunications issues. Before we dive into the regulatory issues, let's quickly go over a few broadband basics. A broadband network includes three main components: the backbone, the middle mile, and last mile. The broadband backbone is comprised of major high-speed transmission lines that run across the country. The middle mile refers to the connection between the backbone and the last mile. And for example, the middle mile can refer to the connection that's between a smaller rural town to the larger metropolitan area and the major broadband providers. The last mile connects consumers and devices to the internet. And broadband is delivered through several types of technology: fiber optic cable, hybrid fiber coax, copper wire, fixed and mobile wireless platforms, and satellite. So let's take a quick moment for the poll question. So what's the most common broadband technology that's in your community? We will pause to give you a couple moments to respond. And I believe that the poll question is down below the screen of the video. All right. So Abby, I'm sorry, I'm going to put you on the spot because unfortunately I can't see the results. So I'm not sure.
I think we have a little bit of a lag, so we'll give everyone just a second.
Okay, good. All right. Should I move on? Do we have any results?
I think we're still gathering the poll results, so you can get right back.
Okay. All right. Well, then I will keep going. If you want to jump in and let me know. So broadband technologies impact the range of speeds that are available to deliver data to you, impacting the quality of the video you watch and the audio you listen to. The slower the internet connection, the more you'll experience delays when downloading and uploading files, watching movies, and working from home. The speed refers to the rate at which the data travels, but the speed is influenced by the bandwidth, meaning the size of the conduit or the pipe, if you will, in which the data travels. So larger bandwidths allow more data to travel through which, and that can increase the speed at which it travels. So in practical terms, it means less buffering. You can see on this slide the minimum download speeds that are associated with common activities. As you can imagine, working from home can require larger speeds. And let's be honest, for broadband users, it's all about the speed. Oops. Go.
I feel the need for speed.
Couldn't resist. So today, broadband speed is typically measured in megabits per second. 1 megabit is equal to 1,000 kilobits. The Federal Communications Commission has set the speed benchmark of 25 megabits for downloads and 3 megabits per second for uploads to assess whether a fixed broadband service, separate from a mobile broadband service, is providing advanced telecommunications capability. So for perspective, typical dial-up connections were no more than 56 kilobytes, and that's kilobytes, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Of course, in 1986, when the movie Top Gun premiered, Maverick and Goose were more worried about G-forces than megabits per second. And in some areas now, speeds are rapidly increasing with gigabit speeds quickly becoming available. Now that we've gone over some of the technological basics, let's get into why we're really here. Broadband regulation. Abby's going to start us off with the federal role.
So first, our poll results, we had 73% said cable internet, 17% responded to DSL, 8% mobile wireless, 8% satellite, and 0% fixed wireless, which is interesting. So telecommunications regulation can be complex. So we'd like to help you understand who regulates broadband and what you can do at the state level. First and foremost, the Federal Communications Commission is the primary regulating authority in the areas of broadband, 5G, robocalling and consumer protection, and telehealth. The FCC regulates interstate and international communications by radio, television, wire, satellite, and cable in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and US territories. The FCC is an independent US government agency overseen by Congress, so it operates a little differently than normal federal agencies. The agency is directed by 5 commissioners. At this point, there are 4, who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The president also selects one of the commissioners to serve as chairman, and it's usually the commissioner who is in the same political party as the president. Only 3 commissioners can be of the same political party at any time, and they have 5-year terms. The FCC operates advisory committees, issues rules, orders, and regulations, regulates competitive frameworks and investments, spectrum management, media relations, regulations, communications infrastructure security. They also take consumer complaints, issue licenses, and manage communication infrastructure. Another important group is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA. As you can tell in broadband, we have a plethora of acronyms. NTIA is located within the Department of Commerce, which is the executive branch agency that is responsible for advising the president on telecoms and information policy issues. NTIA's programs and policymaking focus largely on expanding broadband internet access and adoption in America, expanding the use of spectrum by all users, and ensuring that the internet remains an engine for continued innovation and economic growth. NTIA creates broadband maps and operates some state grants as well. Congress also regulates in this space. Congress provides funding, state grant programs, and sometimes limits or mandates something that the FCC can or can't do. The Senate Commerce and Transportation Committee and House and Energy and Commerce Committees are the primary committees of jurisdiction. There has been some tension between Congress and the FCC, especially in the area of classifying certain communication technologies under Title I or Title II of the Communications Act of 1934. These sections allow the FCC to regulate wire and radio communication services. You've probably heard of Title II in terms of net neutrality, but it affects broadband too. Title II, called Common Carrier, spells out the legal guidelines for the service providers operating under that classification. Key provisions in Title II promote access to infrastructure by providers and affordability for consumers to our traditional phone networks. Without Title II classification, these rules would not apply to broadband services. Title II protects broadband service providers' ability to attach infrastructure to poles as well. The Communications Act authorizes the Commission to regulate pole attachments, which are critical to deploying broadband infrastructure such as 5G. Service providers rely on utility poles to attach a variety of wired and wireless broadband infrastructure cables, such as cable, fiber, and antennas, and small cells. Obtaining leases and permits to attach infrastructure to poles can be expensive, particularly in rural areas where there are more poles per mile. But this classification also impacts subsidized broadband service. But that's just an overview of the federal authority, and Heather is going to talk a little bit more about the state authority.
While the FCC is the primary regulatory authority, states play a vital role in broadband and other telecommunications deployment and governance. There are several states that do not regulate broadband as a utility. At least 15 states have specifically deregulated broadband, eliminating it from the jurisdiction of the State Public Utilities Commission or similar agency. Although several states have deregulated broadband, more than half the states have active commissions, councils, task forces, et cetera, to help develop and promote broadband use. The advantage of creating a statewide broadband authority is that it can provide input on the development of a statewide broadband framework. It can promote public-private sector participation, and it can assist with encouraging adoption and use, meaning deployment, subscribing, that kind of thing, and digital literacy. For example, the Maine Connect ME Authority was created by the legislature with the goal of expanding broadband access in the most rural, unserved areas that have little prospect of service from a traditional provider. The authority identifies unserved areas of the state and then develops proposals for broadband expansion projects, demonstration projects, and other initiatives, and selects and provides funding, resources, and incentives for specific broadband projects. The authority is funded by a 0.25% surcharge on in-state retail communication services and funds proposals through grants, direct investments, or loans made on behalf of, in partnership with, or in support of one or more communication service providers. Some of the authorities that states have been created through statute, and others have been created through the executive branch.
Excuse me, I had to get off mute there. The government also tracks who has broadband and who doesn't, and makes a lot of decisions based on that data. The FCC and NTIA within the Department of Commerce provide the majority of broadband mapping in federal government. NTIA received funding from Congress in 2018 to update the National Broadband Availability Map in coordination with the FCC. NTIA built upon existing partnerships with state and local governments to identify data from state, local, and tribal governments, owners and operators of broadband networks, educational institutions, nonprofits, and cooperatives to create the map. However, some challenge whether the deployment numbers reported by the FCC and NTIA are being overstated because the numbers are calculated by census blocks. If service is provided anywhere in that census block, the deployment can be counted, even if service is provided to only one connection. Others challenge for the reported speeds available versus actual speed. And so you can see here an example of an FCC map. I'm from Iowa, so this is our Iowa broadband map. And there's many different ways to show who has broadband and how effective it is. And on the next two slides, you can see different ways of looking at broadband. This is a map from Esri that shows US public libraries and the percentage of households without broadband around those libraries. On the next slide, you can see access to children, broadband access to children who are being taken care of by their grandparents. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at broadband mapping for public policy making. So it's just an interesting way to look at who has access and who doesn't. A lot of that has to do with learning opportunities and when and where students and children are receiving care. The data in the 2020 Broadband Deployment Report show that generally Americans in areas where fixed and mobile broadband services are deployed typically live in census block groups with a lower percentage of households living in poverty and higher average populations, population densities, and median household incomes than Americans living in areas without coverage. There is some hope that mapping will improve. The Bipartisan Broadband Deployment and Technological Availability Act, known as the DATA Act, requires the FCC to collect more detailed data from broadband providers. The legislation also makes it illegal for providers to knowingly provide false or incomplete information to the FCC and allows co-ops, consumers, local governments, and others to challenge FCC maps with their own data. It also sets strong parameters for service availability data collected from mobile broadband providers to ensure accuracy, creates a process for consumers, state, local, and tribal governments, and other groups to challenge FCC maps with their own data, and establishes a crowdsourcing process that will allow public participation in data collection. It also importantly requires the FCC to use newly created maps when making new awards of broadband funding. And many of the decisions in programming and grants and funding that the FCC makes are based on these maps. The COVID-19 pandemic has especially highlighted the need for accurate mapping, with people working remotely, getting treatment through telehealth, and students attending school online, amplifying the need for consistent quality broadband in all areas of the country.
Without having good data on service and available speeds, policymakers fear that overbuilding in areas that have service and underbuilding in areas that don't have service can happen. So states are responding and are introducing legislation to improve mapping at the state level. Better mapping leads to better data that can help inform policy decisions for deployment and expansion. At least 12 states have statutorily authorized state-level mapping programs. On screen is a screenshot example from the Georgia Broadband Deployment Initiative's website, where they compare the FCC data to data that they collected themselves. Georgia is not alone. The New Mexico Department of Information Technology Broadband Program created a mapping program that acquires customer and service area data twice yearly from each of the broadband telecommunications providers in the state. These data are then used to produce a publicly available web map of areas that are being serviced by broadband and by what technologies. Of course, part of the challenge for mapping and deploying broadband is it takes money, often a lot of money.
Much of the federal funding from broadband comes from the FCC and Congress, often through grants to states. There are also other agencies that provide grants, including the USDA, Department of Transportation, and more. In response to COVID-19, Congress appropriated additional funding for broadband expansion through the CARES Act. The USDA Rural Development Fund also received $25 million for the Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant Program, which is designed to assist rural communities in acquiring distance learning and telemedical technology to allow local teachers and medical service providers who serve rural residents to connect over long distances. The FCC's COVID-19 telehealth program received $200 million in funding during the CARES Act. This program helps healthcare providers connect care services to patients in their homes or at mobile locations. In the additional stimulus bill in September, set aside $7 billion in funding for broadband connectivity and infrastructure. That amount includes $3.2 billion for a $50 a month emergency broadband benefit for low-income households and those who have suffered a significant loss of income in 2020. Also includes a $75 a month rebate for those living on tribal lands and a $1 billion grant for tribal broadband programs, $300 million for rural broadband grants and funds for telehealth, broadband mapping, funding the Data Act we discussed earlier, and broadband in communities surrounding historically Black colleges and universities. The NTIA has a searchable database that you might find helpful of 50 federal broadband programs spanning a dozen federal agencies with billions of dollars for broadband grants, loans, and other resources. The database is part of the American Broadband Initiative to make it easier for community leaders to find federal funding and permitting information. The FCC auction funding mechanism can be particularly complicated. The recent Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, Phase 1, was the FCC's $9 billion initiative to fund rural broadband deployment. There is more than $11 billion set aside for Phase 2, although there was some discussion about whether the funding should be held back until the maps are improved. The FCC's Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is aimed at underserved areas. Through a two-phase reverse auction mechanism, the FCC will direct $20.4 billion over 10 years to finance up to gigabyte speed broadband networks in underserved rural areas. The FCC adopts final adoption procedures for Phase 1, which provided up to $16 billion, targeting census blocks that are wholly unserved with fixed broadband at speeds of at least 25 and 3 megabits per second. The FCC staff estimate that about 6 million rural homes and businesses are located in areas initially eligible in the Phase 1 auction. This auction began in October, and Phase 2 will target partially served areas or census blocks where some locations lack access of the 25, 3 megabits per second broadband.
States are active in broadband funding too, creating loan and incentive programs, grant loan and incentive programs, 36 states and Guam currently have programs that fund broadband deployment, and that includes 11 states who currently allocate portions of their state universal service funds for broadband. 15 states have funding programs geared specifically to deploy broadband to schools and libraries. Next, we'll shift gears to discuss the deployment of the next generation of wireless infrastructure.
So I think most of you have heard about 5G, or maybe you are one of those who is lucky enough to have a phone that runs on 5G. So the deployment of small cells across the United States to allow the widespread use of 5th generation or 5G technology is an area that America is continuously competing against the rest of the world. 5G will be the successor to the 4G networks that currently connect most cell phones. 5G networks will have a greater bandwidth than 4G networks do, which will dramatically increase download speeds. And additionally, 5G networks will not just serve mobile devices. They will connect laptops, automobiles, kitchen appliances, healthcare devices, and other machines. Making all this possible are small cell devices, which allow all 5G wireless devices in service area or a cell to be connected by network, by radio waves emitted through a local antenna in the cell. While the federal government has largely left the implementation of 5G to wireless companies in the private sector, there have been a number of actions that they have taken. The FCC created the 5G Fund for Rural America in October 2020 to distribute up to $9 billion in universal service fund support to carriers to build advanced 5G wireless networks in rural areas. The FCC also implemented an order in 2018 that capped the fees that cities and municipalities could charge wireless carriers in the deployment of small cells. The commission believed that the excessive fees levied by localities would slow down the deployment of small cell devices, of which the commission estimates the United States will need to install as many as 800,000 over the next decade. These are essential for implementing 5G networks.
As Abby described, 5G wireless systems are the next upgrade of wireless technology, offering faster speeds, greater capacity, and better reliability. To deploy this technology, new small cells must be installed throughout the communities. Small cells generate less power, they collect and transmit signals in a shorter range from one another, and they require co-locating the cells on other infrastructure. Small cell wireless facility deployment requires streamlined federal, state, and local permitting, rights of way, application timelines, siting and application fees, and application review timelines and appeals processes to make it economically feasible for wireless companies to deploy the technology across communities. The 5G deployment depends on wireless transmitters and receivers about the size of a picnic cooler or a mini fridge. So these small cells can be located on utility poles or on roofs of buildings, but will require more transmitters than current 4G cellular since 5G signals travel over shorter distances. Let us know in the chat box if you've seen these new transmitters and receivers being installed in your state. Due to the shorter range of 5G, bringing 5G to rural areas may be more challenging. Proponents believe that 5G will have transfer rates of 10 gigabits per second, at least 100 times faster than the current 4G LTE technology. But what exactly does 10 gigabytes mean? According to the Consumer Technology Association, a consumer could download a 2-hour movie in 3.6 seconds on 5G. In comparison, on 4G, it would take 6 minutes, while on 3G, it would take 26 hours. More than 25 state legislatures have enacted small cell legislation that streamlines regulations to facilitate the deployment of 5G small cells. These laws take into consideration the unique circumstances of their state and local environment while establishing baseline principles consistent with wireless industry standards, including streamlined applications to access public rights of way, caps on costs and fees, and streamlined timelines for the consideration and processing of cell siting applications.
One of the most important challenges facing the country today is the digital divide between urban and rural America and access to high-speed internet within urban areas. Access to broadband is critical for a thriving economy. And according to the FCC, 97% of Americans have access to high-speed broadband in urban areas. In rural areas, that number drops to only 65%. The FCC and other agencies have taken multiple steps to close the divide. The FCC's effort include initiating the $3.2 billion emergency broadband benefit program I mentioned earlier that allows eligible households to receive a discount on the cost of broadband service, creating the Digital Opportunity Data Collection Program, which collects broadband data to better determine where gaps in coverage exist through enhanced mapping, and distributing $1.4 billion to expand broadband for over 700,000 rural locations in 45 states through the Connect America Fund reverse auction, which was the model for the RDOF auction. Most importantly, the FCC instituted the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which will allocate $9.2 billion over the next 10 years to unserved areas, which is the largest operation to expand broadband to date. Congress has also appropriated funds towards broadband expansion in the recent COVID-19 packages. And some other solutions being discussed in Congress include sustainable funding and accurate mapping.
Looking at all the broadband research requests that I receive, the question of what states are doing to address the digital divide is the most popular. I track at least 400 broadband bills annually, and the rural and underserved bills are the largest category. The continuing high number of bills and the number of states introducing those bills demonstrates that expanding broadband availability continues to be a priority for states. Unfortunately, I can't say that there is a single solution that will solve the broadband deployment question, as no state has 100% deployment. 30 states and Puerto Rico have 154 bills addressing digital divide, rural and underserved issues in the 2021 legislative session. 6 states, Connecticut, Hawaii, Maryland, New York, Oregon, and Virginia, have bills regarding the affordability of broadband service. For example, Maryland has companion bills in both the House and Senate that would rename the existing Rural Broadband Assistance Fund to be named the Maryland Digital Connectivity Fund, so that it can cover both rural and more urban areas that have pockets of no service, and alter the purpose of the fund to include expansion of affordable broadband services. Some states have authorized electric cooperatives and utilities to aid in expanding broadband by increasing the capacity of the fiber cable that they install for smart grid technologies. In the past few years, more than 10 states have enacted legislation regarding electric utilities and broadband deployment. As states have authorized electric utilities to participate in the middle mile deployment, policymakers have worked to identify and remove an array of barriers that impede deployment and undermine incentives to invest in certain communities. Granting authority to the electric co-ops and utilities to deploy broadband is not without controversy, as some parties have raised concerns around possible cross-subsidization by utilities. Fees for attaching broadband equipment to utility poles and pole maintenance fees also have been raised as a concern. Since there are costs for the poles and their maintenance, utilities charge these fees to internet service providers for carrying their telecommunications lines. Cost-sharing mechanisms between the electric utilities and internet service providers can be used to address some of those concerns around the appropriate charges for this service. In addition, states are considering other options, such as dig-once policies that help co-locate equipment and fiber during major construction projects. We hope you found that this broadband overview has been helpful. If you would like to review the full text of the 2021 and 2020 state legislation for both broadband and 5G, you can find the links for those documents in the resources section below the video screen. Now, let's turn to you, the audience. What questions do you have for us about broadband? There we go. So it looks like while we are waiting for you to enter some of those questions, let's see. So going back to some of the regulatory issues that we have seen, Abby, where can lawmakers find proposed rules open for comment from the FCC?
That's a great question, because it's really important for state and local lawmakers to participate in this process. So I think Trace will put in the chat a link to where you can find open rules for comment from the FCC. The FCC does not operate like a normal agency, but they do still go through the rulemaking process. So proposed rules will be posted there. NCSL does sometimes comment on these, and they also welcome state and local lawmakers to comment. So please pass that on to legislators, and it's easy to just go on there and let them know what the state impact will be.
Perfect. That's great. And let's see, looks like we have another question. So have you identified case studies of municipal Wi-Fi broadband in cities that have been successful? Let's see, in terms of case studies, there are several states that do allow for municipal Wi-Fi and broadband deployment. There are a few communities that have done it. So I know that there are some cities in Chattanooga. There's one in Longmont, Colorado that has done it. So we have, I do have a chart that specifies the state laws that allow for, that regulate whether or not states allow for the municipal broadband. So that is something that I can share after the meeting. Unfortunately, I didn't get that posted to the website before. But yeah, absolutely. Those are some resources that I can pull together for you and give you some examples of some successful Wi-Fi municipal or government-owned broadband programs. Let's see. So Abby, we've got another one. Do you know, is Congress planning more broadband funding this year?
Broadband is one of those issues that crosses party lines. Everybody is interested in getting people connected, and COVID-19 has really shown both parties and state and local governments, as well as federal government, how important it is to get everyone connected and where the gaps in their communities are. So I would encourage everyone to keep an eye on the upcoming infrastructure package. I think that's where a lot of the broadband funding is going to be in the near future. But I think long-term, we're going to see continued investment through the FCC and through direct COVID-19 and state broadband programs to states.
That's great to hear. So definitely, I was going to say, as we've got a couple more questions, but absolutely, please feel free, keep those questions coming. We've got plenty of time. Let's see. So another one that I see says, since we are still in the midst of the pandemic, are there examples of what states did to help connect people in the short term? And states absolutely were filing bills last year, and they did take some actions that would help states and help consumers and students. For example, North Carolina appropriated $1 million to install extended reach mobile Wi-Fi gateway router devices, really hard to say, in school buses, and $11 million to provide community and home mobile internet access points to improve internet connectivity for students. They specified that these funds could only be used for the purchase of devices and not for subscription services. Mississippi also, they appropriated funds from their technology instruction and digital access to learning, known as what they call the Title Grant Program, to fund the State Department of Education to facilitate distance learning, and created the COVID-19 Connectivity Act. For more examples, you can access the COVID-19 state legislation database that's on NCSL's website. And I believe our colleague Trace will be very nice and will copy that link into the chat box for us. Let's see, just double checking if there are other questions. Let's see, so going back to the mapping, you said looks like you're asking what states enacted their own mapping programs. So those states are Alaska, Georgia, Hawaii, Maine, Massachusetts, Oregon, Pennsylvania, Utah, Vermont, and Washington. Let's see. Anything else? Definitely. Okay, let's see. We've got another one. You mentioned that 11 states use their state universal service funds to fund broadband. What are those 11 states? So those 11 states are Arkansas, California, Colorado, Maine, Minnesota, Nebraska, New Mexico, Oregon, Utah, Vermont, and Washington. And definitely keep those questions coming. We like having questions. Let's see. So Abby, let's see. So we'll see if we can split this one. So what did states do with all the coronavirus relief funds that they received last year? Could you go in? Do you have any information about sort of how some more of that money was spent?
Yeah, I think Trace can drop some of that information in the chat. A lot of states use this specifically for connecting their students and telehealth services that didn't have access, especially in rural areas. States were also really creative in creating new connections. They used school buses as mobile zones, created hotspots near schools or places where a lot of students could gather, made sure that libraries and other common spaces were connected, and sent hotspots home with students. So states were really creative, and there's, I think, a pretty good list in that link of how exactly states spent the funding. What did you see from the state side?
Well, on the state side, of course, to ease the financial strain that on state spending in response to the COVID-19 mitigation and response measures, the federal government, they included in the CARES Act $150, or sorry, $150. 150, yeah, that'd go really, really far, wouldn't it? 150 billion, let's try that again, billion, in direct access assistance for state governments, local and tribal governments. These funds are known as the coronavirus relief funds, and each state received a minimum allocation of 1.25 billion. The local governments that had a population of at least 500,000 were also eligible for direct payments. And our colleagues in the NCSL fiscal program created a database that illustrates how those states use their CRF allocations. And hopefully, as I say, this is the signal to Trace if he has time to link that database. So of course, in that allocation, states were limited on what they could spend that money for. So it had to be related to coronavirus. And so a lot of the states, in terms of spending that money on broadband and technology, that they used it to help students to get connected. And so, some of that money that Mississippi, when I mentioned earlier that Mississippi used, a lot of that money was coming from their CRF funds. So let's see. Do we have any other questions? Like I said, please feel free. You have us here at your disposal, and we're happy to answer questions. Okay. Well, it looks like, and just as a reminder, of course, too, that, like I said, the 2020 legislation list and the 2021 legislation list are for both broadband and 5G are posted on the NCSL website. We do have other additional resources available as well. We've got earlier years are up there too. In case you want to go back, but it didn't necessarily need to send those links to you. Let's see. So I think we have managed to get through all of our questions.
I would also encourage you, our contact information. If you or your lawmakers have issues contacting the FCC, have a question about your grant or a mapping issue, please reach out to us. We have a great relationship with the FCC, the NTIA, and the congressional committees. So if there's anything on the federal side that you have questions about or having issues with, please reach out to us.
Yeah, and Abby, do you want to give them your email address? I know he's probably posting it, but
yeah, I think our email addresses should be posted in there, and Heather is a wealth of information for any telecoms issues on the state side. So please reach out if you have a question about a bill in another state.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, Abby is correct. We've got lots of resources available for you because this can be a very complicated issue. And I have to admit, I don't have all of my charts posted online. But absolutely, if there is something that you're looking for and you can't find it online for state legislation or state statutes, absolutely feel free, reach out, contact me, and I'm happy to help. So I think, let's see, it doesn't look like any more have come in while we were chatting about reaching us. So I think we will go ahead and wrap up. Abby, do you have any final words?
Just so we know, this is a really complicated issue, so please feel free to reach out, and thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us. and have a good rest of the day. And definitely, I encourage you to stick around for the other sessions that are going on today. There's lots of stuff going on, lots of stuff to learn. Thank you so much.